You are not following HOA rules. Please follow the rules or leave. I will make sure to get you out of my HOA property because this is all mine and you are here to follow my rules.
The judge slammed his gavel down so hard the sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Karen Pembroke's face went from triumphant pink to ghostly white in the span of 3 seconds flat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table, knuckles turning bone white. The woman who had terrorized me for 6 straight months, who had measured my grass with a ruler, who had fined me for the color of my garden hose, who had threatened to destroy my life with lawsuits and liens, that woman was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her entire existence. She thought she was about to win. She thought this courtroom was going to be her throne room. She thought I was just another victim she could crush under her designer heels. What she did not know, what she could not have possibly imagined in her wildest nightmares, was that the very ground she stood on, the land her precious house was built upon, belonged to me. I had the documents right here in my briefcase. $18,000 in back rent, $400 a month going forward, and the complete and total annihilation of her reign as the Queen of Maple Grove. This is the story of how I accidentally discovered the most ironic piece of evidence in HOA history. How I took down the most ruthless homeowners association president our neighborhood had ever seen, and how karma delivered justice in a way so perfect, so beautifully poetic, that even I had trouble believing it when it all unfolded. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, 6 months before that glorious day in court, when I made what I genuinely believed was the smartest decision of my adult life. I was moving into what my realtor called a rare opportunity in the historic Maple Grove subdivision. The corner lot on Elm Street and 2nd Avenue had been sitting unsold for almost a year. A full year on the market in a neighborhood where houses usually sold in weeks. I should have taken that as a warning sign. I really, truly should have asked more questions about why nobody wanted this property. But I was 42 years old, recently divorced, and desperately ready for a fresh start. The price was more than fair. The commute to my job at the accounting firm downtown was ideal, just 22 minutes door to door. And the 1960s ranch-style house needed work, sure, but it had good bones. Original hardwood floors under the worn carpet, a fireplace with a gorgeous stone surround, a backyard big enough for the garden I had always dreamed of planting. What could possibly go wrong? I asked myself as I signed the closing documents. I got my answer approximately 14 hours later. The moving truck had arrived at 7 in the morning. My buddy Steve and his teenage son helped me haul boxes and furniture until nearly midnight. I was exhausted, covered in sweat and cardboard dust, surrounded by towers of unpacked boxes in my new living room. I had just poured myself a well-deserved beer and collapsed onto my couch, which was still wrapped in moving blankets, when I heard it. A sharp, rapid knock at my front door. Not a friendly neighbor knock. Not a welcome to the neighborhood knock. This was an aggressive, demanding, I know you are in there and you will answer me immediately kind of knock. I groaned, set down my beer, and shuffled to the door in my stained moving day t-shirt and worn jeans. When I opened it, I found a woman standing on my porch like a drill sergeant conducting an inspection. She was in her early 50s, with hair that had been teased and sprayed into a helmet of perfection. She wore pressed khaki pants with a crease sharp enough to cut paper, and a crisp white button-down shirt that had the letters MGHA embroidered in navy blue over her heart. Maple Grove Homeowners Association, I would later learn. In her manicured hands, she clutched a clipboard like a weapon, and her eyes swept over me with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of a shoe. I am Karen Pembroke, she announced without so much as a hello or a welcome or even a basic acknowledgement that I was a human being standing in front of her. President of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. We need to talk about several violations I have already noticed. I blinked at her, still half asleep, still exhausted from 14 hours of moving. I am sorry, I said, trying to process what was happening. Did you say violations? I just moved in today. I have not even finished unpacking. She consulted her clipboard with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing 1,000 times before. First violation, she said crisply. Your moving truck was parked on the street for longer than the permitted 2 hours. The Maple Grove covenants clearly state that all commercial vehicles must be removed within 120 minutes of arrival. Your truck was present for approximately 17 hours. That is a $300 fine. My jaw dropped. $300 for a moving truck on my own street in front of my own house. Second violation, she continued, completely ignoring my shock. Your lawn is currently 3/4 of an inch above regulation height. Maple Grove requires all lawns to be maintained at precisely 2¼ inches. Yours is measuring at 3 inches. That is a $100 fine for the first offense. I had not even mowed the lawn yet. I had literally just taken ownership of the property. The previous owners had left it slightly overgrown. I tried to explain this, but she cut me off with a raised hand. Third violation, she said, her voice growing colder with each word. Your mailbox. It is not an approved model. The Maple Grove Homeowners Association has a list of 17 pre-approved mailbox designs. Yours is not on that list. It appears to be a generic big box store model, which is absolutely unacceptable. You have 14 days to replace it with an approved design, or you will be fined $200 per week until compliance is achieved. She ripped 3 sheets of paper from her clipboard and thrust them toward me. I took them automatically, still too stunned to form coherent words. These are your violation notices, she said. Payment is due within 30 days. Checks can be mailed to the HOA address listed at the bottom, or you can pay online through our portal. There is a 3% processing fee for online payments. She paused, and then her lips curled into a smile so tight, so forced, so completely devoid of actual warmth that it could have cracked glass. Welcome to the neighborhood, she said. And then she turned on her sensible beige heel and strode away down my walkway, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a general carrying battle plans. I watched her go, completely dumbfounded, and that is when I noticed something that would become very significant later. Her house sat directly behind mine. Our backyards shared a fence line. I could see her property from my kitchen window. I would later learn that she could see mine from her back porch, which explained a lot about what happened next. That first encounter was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Karen Pembroke made it her personal mission to transform my fresh start into a living nightmare. She seemed to have nothing better to do with her time than watch my property like a hawk waiting for a field mouse to make a wrong move. 2 days after I moved in, she knocked on my door again to inform me that my garbage cans were visible from the street. Apparently, the Maple Grove covenants required all waste receptacles to be stored in an enclosed area or behind a fence at least 6 feet tall. My cans were sitting beside my garage, partially visible if you stood at just the right angle on the sidewalk and really craned your neck to look. That was a $75 fine. A week later, I came home from work to find a violation notice taped to my front door. The offense, my garden hose was green. According to Karen's letter, all exterior equipment, including hoses, must be in an approved neutral color, brown, black, or beige only. Green was considered too visually disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. I had to buy a new hose or face a $50 weekly fine until I complied. I bought the new hose. It cost me $34 for a brown hose that looked like a dead snake lying in my yard. The following week, she measured the distance between my trash cans with an actual tape measure. I watched her do it from my living room window, too astonished to even go outside and confront her. She crouched down on my driveway in her pressed khakis, extended the metal tape measure, and wrote something on her ever-present clipboard. 2 days later, I received a notice informing me that my waste receptacles were placed 7 inches too close together, which created a clustered appearance that violated Section 4, subsection 12 of the Neighborhood Aesthetic Guidelines. The fine was $60. When I installed new blinds in my living room, she knocked on my door the very next morning at 7:15, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. I opened the door to find her standing there with her arms crossed and her face arranged in an expression of profound disappointment. "Your window treatments," she said without preamble. "They are the wrong color." I stared at her. "They are white," I said. "Plain white blinds." "They are off-white," she corrected me. "Eggshell, specifically. The Maple Grove covenants require all visible window treatments to be pure white. Not cream, not ivory, not eggshell, pure, bright, snow white. You have 7 days to replace them." I could not believe what I was hearing. "You are seriously telling me that you can tell the difference between my white blinds and pure white from the street?" "I have an excellent eye for color," she said flatly. "And the rules are the rules. I did not write them, I simply enforce them." That was a lie, I would later discover. She had, in fact, written most of the rules herself over her 20-year reign as HOA president. She had amended the covenants dozens of times, adding increasingly ridiculous requirements that gave her more and more power to fine homeowners for virtually anything. The original Maple Grove covenants from the 1970s had been a simple 2-page document about maintaining your lawn and not parking RVs in your driveway. Karen's version had ballooned to 47 pages of micromanaging tyranny. But the absolute breaking point, the thing that finally pushed me from frustrated acceptance to active resistance, came about 3 months after I moved in. I arrived home from work on a Friday afternoon to find a certified letter in my mailbox. The return address was the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal demand for payment of 6 months of back HOA dues, plus late fees and penalties. The total amount owed was $2,417. I read the letter 3 times, convinced I must be misunderstanding something. According to Karen's letter, the previous owner of my property had stopped paying HOA dues approximately 6 months before selling. And now that I was the new owner, the debt had transferred to me. I was responsible for paying someone else's delinquent fees. I called the HOA phone number listed on the letter, which went straight to voicemail. I left 3 messages over the course of the weekend, none of which were returned. Finally, on Monday morning, I walked over to Karen's house and knocked on her door. I was going to handle this like a reasonable adult. I would explain the situation, show her my closing documents proving I had never agreed to assume any HOA debt, and we would sort this out like civilized people. Karen opened her door wearing what I now recognized as her HOA uniform, pressed khakis, white button-down with the embroidered logo, and that clipboard perpetually in hand. She looked at me like I was something the cat had dragged in and then decided was not worth eating. "Mr. Thompson," she said coolly, "I assume you received our letter." "I did," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "And I think there has been some kind of mistake. I never agreed to assume any debt from the previous owner. My closing documents should show that the property was transferred free and clear of any liens or obligations." Karen sighed like I was a particularly slow child who could not grasp basic arithmetic. "There is no mistake," she said. "Every homeowner in Maple Grove pays HOA dues. It is not optional. It is not negotiable. It is a legal requirement that runs with the land." "But the previous owner's debt," I started to say. "Is now your debt," she finished. "When you purchased that property, you assumed all responsibilities associated with it, including any outstanding dues. That is how property ownership works, Mr. Thompson." "I would like to review my closing documents," I said firmly. "I want to verify exactly what obligations I agreed to." Karen's expression shifted from condescending to icy cold. "There is nothing to review," she said. "Every property in this subdivision is subject to HOA membership. There are no exceptions. If you do not pay the outstanding balance within 30 days, I will place a lien on your property. And if you continue to refuse payment, the HOA will begin foreclosure proceedings." "Foreclosure proceedings," I repeated, incredulous. "You are threatening to take my house over $2,000 in fees that someone else owed." "The rules are the rules," Karen said in that infuriating sing-song voice she used when she knew she had you cornered. "I would suggest you write a check and move on with your life. Fighting this will only cost you more money in the end." And with that, she closed her door in my face. Before we go any further with this story, I want to take a moment to address something. If you believe that people like Karen exist in the real world, and trust me, they absolutely do, and if you believe they need to be held accountable for their behavior, then I want you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel right now. We share stories just like this one every single day. Stories about ordinary people standing up to bullies and tyrants. Stories about karma delivering justice in the most satisfying ways imaginable. These stories will change how you see the world, and I promise you, they will satisfy that deep need we all have to see the bad guys get what they deserve. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of people who believe in fighting back against injustice. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. That night, after Karen had threatened to foreclose on my home over $2,400 in fees I did not owe, I did something I should have done from the very beginning. I cleared off my dining room table, opened a bottle of wine, and spread out every single document from my property closing. The deed, the survey, the title report, the settlement statement, the disclosure forms, everything I had barely skimmed at the time because I was so excited to finally own my own home. I started with the deed, reading every word carefully instead of just skimming for the important parts. It was standard language at first, describing the property by its lot number and block number, referencing the plat map recorded with the county. But attached to the deed, stapled right there in the middle of the document stack, was something I had completely overlooked during closing. It was a land lease agreement, dated July 15th, 1973. I pulled it out and read it carefully, word by word. The document was faded and yellowed, clearly a copy of something that had been recorded decades ago. The language was dense and legalistic, full of whereases and heretofores, but the basic meaning was clear enough once I puzzled through it. According to this lease agreement, my property included not just the corner lot I had purchased, the lot with the house on it, but also a leased strip of land that extended beyond the surveyed property line. The lease term was 9 to 9 years, and the lease had been paid in full up front. The payment amount was listed as $8,500, which in 1973 money was probably equivalent to $50,000 or more today. I pulled up the county's online property records on my laptop and started searching. What I found over the next several hours would eventually bring Karen Pembroke to her knees, but at the time, I was simply confused. There were layers of documents, transfers, amendments, and corrections going back 50 years. The records were a tangled mess of overlapping claims and outdated surveys. But slowly, painstakingly, I started to piece together what had happened. In the early 1970s, a developer named Franklin Associates had purchased a large tract of farmland on the outskirts of town with the intention of building the Maple Grove subdivision. But the developer had run into financial trouble before completing the project. To raise cash, they had sold 9 to 9-year land leases on various parcels throughout the development. These lease payments provided upfront capital to continue construction, while the developer retained underlying ownership of the land. Then, in 1978, Franklin Associates had gone bankrupt. The assets had been sold off piecemeal to various buyers. Some of the land had been purchased outright. Some had remained subject to the original leases. And in the chaos of bankruptcy proceedings and asset sales, the records had become hopelessly jumbled. Properties had changed hands multiple times over the decades, and nobody had bothered to untangle the original lease agreements. My lot, the corner of Elm Street and 2nd Avenue, had originally been a leased parcel. The lease had been paid in full in 1973, giving the leaseholder exclusive rights to that land for 9 to 9 years, until 2072. When the bankruptcy happened, the property had eventually been sold to someone who built the ranch house in 1982. That house had changed hands several times before I bought it, and somewhere along the way, everyone had forgotten about the underlying lease agreement. But here is where things got really interesting. According to the original lease documents, the leased parcel extended beyond the current surveyed boundaries of my lot. It included a strip of land approximately 25 feet wide that ran along my entire back property line and extended about 40 feet into what was currently considered my neighbor's property. My neighbor, Karen Pembroke. I sat back in my chair, wine glass forgotten, heart pounding. Was it possible? Could it actually be true? I needed to verify this. I needed professional help. The next morning, I was waiting outside the county recorder's office when it opened at 8 o'clock. I had called in sick to work, too wired from a sleepless night to focus on anything but this mystery. The office was in an old municipal building downtown, staffed by a handful of civil servants who had probably been there since the Nixon administration. The man who helped me was named Harold, a clerk in his late 60s with thick glasses and a patient demeanor that suggested he had seen everything at least twice. I explained what I was looking for, the history of the Maple Grove development, the 1973 lease agreements, and any records that might clarify the current property boundaries. Harold listened carefully, nodding along, and then his eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, I remember this mess," he said, already moving toward the back room where the oldest records were stored. The Maple Grove leases. We still get questions about those every few years. He spent the next 2 hours pulling boxes of yellowed documents, ancient plat maps, and faded photographs from the archives. He spread them across a large table in the research room and walked me through the history piece by piece. Back in the 70s, he explained, his finger tracing the boundary lines on an original survey map, the developer used these long-term land leases to finance construction. Sold leases on maybe 24 parcels throughout the subdivision. When they went bankrupt, everything got scattered. Some leases were bought out. Some were forgotten. Nobody ever cleaned up the records properly. It was a different time. Computers were not around yet. Half of this stuff was filed in the wrong place for decades. I showed him my lease agreement and asked him to help me understand exactly what land it covered. Harold put on a pair of magnifying glasses and studied the document carefully, comparing it to the original plat maps. "Well now," he said slowly, "this is interesting. According to this lease, you have rights to the land extending approximately 40 feet beyond your surveyed property line to the south." He traced the boundary with his finger. That would put it right about, and he paused, pulling up a modern aerial photograph on his computer, right about here. He pointed to a section of the photograph that clearly showed a house. A 2-story colonial with beige siding and brown shutters. A house I recognized immediately. "That is Karen Pembroke's house," I said, barely breathing. Harold compared the aerial photo to the lease boundaries again. "Sure is," he confirmed. "Looks like when that house was built in 1991, they built it partially on land that was already leased to your property." He measured something on the map with a ruler. About 20 feet of encroachment, give or take. Includes part of the house foundation and a good chunk of the backyard. I sat down heavily in one of the research room chairs. My head was spinning. Karen Pembroke, the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Grove, the woman who would fine me for the color of my garden hose, the woman who was threatening to foreclose on my home over $2,000 in HOA dues, had been illegally occupying my land for over 30 years. I asked Harold for certified copies of every relevant document, the original lease agreement, the plat maps, the survey records, the building permits for Karen's house that showed when it was constructed, everything I would need to prove my case. He charged me $47 for the copies and wished me luck. I spent the entire drive home laughing. Not a triumphant laugh, not yet. More of a disbelieving, this cannot actually be happening, the universe must be playing tricks on me kind of laugh. But by the time I pulled into my driveway, the laughter had faded into something else. A cold, calm determination. Karen Pembroke had made my life miserable for 3 months. She had fined me hundreds of dollars for imaginary violations. She had threatened to take my home. And now I had in my possession documents that proved she had been trespassing on my property for 3 decades. It was time to find a lawyer. I did my research carefully. I was not about to trust something this important to just anyone. After 3 days of reading online reviews, asking for recommendations, and conducting phone interviews, I settled on David Lawson of Lawson and Associates. David was a real estate attorney in his early 50s who specialized in property disputes. He had a reputation for being thorough, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when protecting his clients' interests. We met in his office on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a corner office on the third floor of a downtown building with windows overlooking the city park. David was a trim man with silver-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He listened as I explained the situation, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, never interrupting. When I finished, I handed over the folder containing all the documents I had gathered. David took his time reviewing them, occasionally pausing to reread a passage or compare two documents side by side. The silence stretched on for nearly 20 minutes while he worked. Finally, he set down the folder and looked at me with what I could only describe as barely suppressed glee. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "this is one of the most interesting cases I have seen in my entire career. If these documents are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, you have an extraordinarily strong legal position." "What exactly does that mean?" I asked. David leaned back in his chair. "It means that your lease agreement predates the HOA, predates the construction of Mrs. Pembroke's house, and predates any covenants or restrictions she might try to enforce against you. You are, legally speaking, not a member of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. You never have been. The HOA has no authority over your property whatsoever." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. So I do not have to pay the $2,000 they are demanding. "Not a cent of it," David confirmed. "Your property is completely exempt from HOA jurisdiction. But that is actually the less interesting part of your case." He stood and walked to a large map of the county that hung on his wall. He traced an area with his finger. "The really interesting part," he continued, "is that Mrs. Pembroke's house is partially built on land that you have leased. Under normal circumstances, this would be a case of adverse possession, and she might have some claim to the land after occupying it for so many years. But," and he turned to face me with a slight smile, "adverse possession does not apply to leased land. She cannot claim ownership of something you are only leasing yourself, and your lease is fully paid up through 2072. "So what does that mean?" I asked. "What are my options?" David returned to his chair. "Legally speaking, you have several options. First, you could demand that she remove the encroaching structure. That would mean tearing down part of her house." I shook my head. "That seems extreme. I do not want to destroy someone's home." "I suspected you would say that," David said approvingly. "Second option, you could demand retroactive rent for the unauthorized use of your leased land. We would calculate fair market value for the square footage she is occupying, multiply it by the number of years she has been there, and present her with a bill." "That sounds more reasonable." "Third," David continued, "you could use this as leverage to negotiate a settlement. Get her to drop the HOA claims against you, stop the harassment, and perhaps pay a reasonable sum for past use of the land." I thought about it for a moment. "What would you recommend?" David smiled. "I recommend we start by sending her attorney a letter explaining the situation and requesting a meeting to discuss resolution. We do not need to show all our cards at once. We simply inform her that there is a boundary issue that requires attention and that your property is exempt from HOA membership based on pre-existing agreements. How she responds will tell us a lot about how to proceed. And if she does not respond well, then we take her to court," David said simply, "and we win." He spent the next 2 weeks combing through every document, verifying authenticity, researching case law, and building what he called an airtight case. When he finally called me into his office for an update, his words were both surreal and deeply satisfying. "Lease is valid," David said, tapping the stack of papers on his desk. "It was properly recorded with the county in 1973 and has never been cancelled or bought out. You have exclusive rights to that land until 2072. Mrs. Pembroke has been trespassing, technically speaking, for over 30 years. You could demand rent for all that time, though realistically a court would probably limit recovery to the statute of limitations period, which in this state is 3 years. But going forward, she would need to either negotiate a new lease with you, purchase the underlying rights, or remove the encroaching structure." How much rent are we talking about? I asked. David pulled out a calculator. Based on current land values in Maple Grove and the square footage of the encroachment, I would estimate fair market rent at approximately $400 per month. For 3 years of back rent, we are looking at around $14,400, plus interest, plus our legal fees if we have to litigate. Realistically, you could be looking at a judgment of $18,000 to $20,000. I sat in stunned silence. $20,000 from the woman who would fine me $50 for having a green garden hose. David seemed to read my mind. Ironic, is it not? The woman who has been nickel and diming you over paint colors and grass height owes you tens of thousands of dollars for unauthorized use of your land, and there is not a single thing she can do about it. I want to proceed, I said. Send the letter. With pleasure, David replied. The letter was a masterpiece of legal understatement. It was addressed to Corinne Pembroke, care of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, and it stated simply that my property was exempt from HOA membership due to a pre-existing lease agreement that predated the formation of the HOA. It requested that all pending fines and demands be withdrawn immediately. And then, almost as an afterthought, it mentioned that a review of property records had revealed a boundary issue that would require resolution, and that we would be in touch to discuss the matter further. We sent it on a Friday. Corinne's response came the following Monday, and it was not delivered by mail. I was working from home that day, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when I heard someone pounding on my front door with the force of a battering ram. I knew who it was before I even got up. Nobody else knocked like that. I opened the door to find Corinne Pembroke standing on my porch, her face a shade of red I had previously thought was only possible in cartoons. She was clutching our letter in one hand, and it was shaking visibly. Her other hand was balled into a fist at her side. "How dare you?" she spat before I could even say good morning. "How dare you try to weasel out of your obligations with some made-up technicality?" I leaned against my doorframe, keeping my voice deliberately calm. "Good morning, Corinne. I see you received our letter." "This is garbage," she said, shaking the paper in my face. "Absolute garbage. I do not care what some lazy lawyer says. You live in Maple Grove. You pay dues like everyone else. There are no exceptions." "I suggest you have your attorney review the documents we referenced," I said evenly. "This is not a loophole or some made-up trick. It is a legal reality. My property is not subject to HOA jurisdiction, and it never has been." Corinne's face somehow got even redder. "We will see about that," she hissed. "I am filing a lawsuit first thing Monday morning. You are going to pay those dues, and you are going to pay every legal fee it costs me to teach you a lesson. By the time I am done with you, you will wish you had never set foot in this neighborhood." She spun on her heel and stormed back toward her house, her footsteps pounding against my walkway with each step. I watched her go, not angry, not worried, just calmly satisfied. She had no idea what was coming. I called David as soon as she was out of sight. "She is suing us," I told him. "I was hoping she would," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "This is going to be fun." True to her word, Corinne filed suit the following Monday. The complaint was 12 pages of legal jargon that basically accused me of fraud, breach of contract, unjust enrichment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress on the HOA board. The damages demanded totaled over $10,000, including the original dues, late fees, penalties, legal costs, and what she called compensation for the extraordinary time and effort the HOA has expended in attempting to bring the defendant into compliance. David and I prepared our response together. It took us 3 days to get the wording exactly right. Our answer denied all of Corinne's claims and asserted that my property was exempt from HOA membership based on the pre-existing lease agreement. We filed a motion to dismiss all claims as a matter of law. But we did not stop there. Attached to our answer was a counterclaim. We were suing Corinne Pembroke for trespassing and unjust enrichment, demanding compensation for 30 years of unauthorized use of my leased land. We included copies of all the relevant documents: the 1973 lease agreement, the county recorder's certified records, the building permits for Karen's house, and a surveyor's report we had commissioned showing exactly how much of her property encroached on my leased land. The counterclaim made everything very clear. Karen Pembroke's house, the same house from which she had been issuing fines and conducting HOA business for 2 decades, was partially built on land that belonged to someone else, to me. The moment Karen's lawyer received our counterclaim with the attached property documents, the tone of the entire case shifted dramatically. Her attorney was a young man named Bradley Morrison. He worked for a small firm that handled a lot of HOA work in the area. He was probably in his late 20s, eager and ambitious, but clearly not prepared for what we had thrown at him. 2 days after we filed our counterclaim, David received a phone call. He put it on speaker so I could listen. "David, this is Bradley Morrison," the young attorney said, his voice carefully neutral. "I am calling about the Pembroke versus Thompson matter." "Yes, Bradley, what can I do for you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I have reviewed the documents attached to your counterclaim," Bradley said slowly, each word measured and careful. "I have to say, I do not think my client fully understood the situation when she initiated this litigation." "That seems to be a fair assessment," David replied pleasantly. "Perhaps we could discuss a resolution," Bradley continued, "without further litigation, something that would be mutually beneficial for all parties." David glanced at me, and I shook my head. We had come too far to back down now. "I appreciate the call, Bradley," David said, "but my client has been harassed, threatened, and fined for months over violations that should never have been issued. He has been forced to hire legal counsel and spend considerable time and money defending himself against claims that have no legal basis. At this point, I'm afraid we are not interested in a quiet settlement. We want this matter resolved in court, with a clear judgment that establishes once and for all that my client's property is exempt from HOA jurisdiction. And we want fair compensation for the unauthorized use of his leased land." Bradley sighed heavily. "I understand," he said. "I will convey your position to my client." But Karen was Karen. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence that her case was doomed, she refused to back down. The settlement conference was held 3 weeks later in a conference room at the county courthouse. A retired judge named Patricia Chen served as the mediator. She was a small woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Karen arrived at the conference dressed like she was attending a corporate board meeting. She wore an expensive grey suit with a silk blouse, and her hair and makeup were immaculate. She sat across the table from me with her arms folded and an icy glare fixed on my face, as if sheer willpower could make the property documents disappear. "This is ridiculous," she said as soon as everyone was seated. "I have lived in that house for 20 years. My husband and I raised our children there. We paid for that property fair and square. You cannot just waltz in here with some ancient piece of paper and claim I am on your land." David calmly spread out the evidence on the table: the original deed from 1973, the lease agreement, survey maps from the county recorder, aerial photographs with the property lines clearly marked, certified letters from the county confirming the authenticity of all documents. Bradley Morrison's face drained of color as he flipped through each page. He had clearly tried to explain this to Karen before the conference, but she had not wanted to hear it. "Mrs. Pembroke," he said quietly, leaning over to speak directly into her ear, "these documents appear to be legitimate. Your house is partially built on land leased to Mr. Thompson. This is," he paused, searching for the right words, "this is not a battle we can win." "Then the documents are wrong," Karen barked, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. She slammed her hand on the table so hard that the coffee cups rattled. "This is fraud, pure and simple. He is making this up to avoid paying what he owes." Judge Chen, the mediator, spent nearly an hour reviewing the evidence. She examined each document carefully, asked clarifying questions, and took detailed notes. Finally, she set down her pen and peered at Karen over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Pembroke," she said in a tone that brooked no argument, "I have been a judge for 35 years, and I have seen many property disputes in my career. I have seen forged documents. I have seen fraudulent claims. I have seen people try to manipulate the system in every way imaginable. These documents are not any of those things. They are authentic. They were properly recorded with the county. They are legally binding. Mr. Thompson's property is exempt from HOA membership, and his lease rights clearly predate the construction of your home." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Judge Chen held up her hand. "I strongly suggest you consider settling this matter," she continued. "If this goes to trial, you will lose, and the judgment against you could be significant. Mr. Thompson would be well within his rights to seek removal of the encroaching structure, which would mean tearing down part of your house. He is offering you a much more reasonable alternative." Karen sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she pushed back from the table and stood up abruptly. "I'm not settling anything," she announced, her voice trembling with fury. "I'm not paying rent on my own home, and I am certainly not admitting that anything I did was wrong. I will see him in court, and when I win, I am going to make sure he never lives another peaceful day in this neighborhood." She stormed out of the conference room without another word. Bradley Morrison gathered up his papers with the weary resignation of a man who knew his client was marching toward disaster and could not stop her. "I am sorry about this," he said quietly to David on his way out. "I tried to explain the situation to her." David nodded sympathetically. Some people have to learn lessons the hard way. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later. During that time, Karen continued her campaign of harassment, though she was more careful now that she knew we were watching. The fines stopped, but she found other ways to make my life difficult. She organized neighborhood watch meetings specifically to discuss problem residents, which everyone knew meant me. She spread rumors that I was a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the HOA. She convinced several neighbors to stop speaking to me entirely. But I did not let it bother me. I knew what was coming. I spent those 3 months working with David to prepare our case, documenting every instance of harassment, gathering witness statements from neighbors who had also been targeted by Karen's tyrannical rule over the years. We built a case file that was over 300 pages thick. And finally, the day arrived, the showdown that Karen had been so confident she would win. I will never forget the expression on Karen Pembroke's face the day she marched into that courtroom. Chin held high, hair teased and sprayed to absolute perfection, a designer handbag swinging at her side like a trophy. She wore her best suit, a navy blue Chanel knockoff that probably cost more than my first car. Her HOA president pin was prominently displayed on her lapel, glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. She gripped her lawsuit papers in her manicured hand like they were a golden ticket to victory. She was already picturing the smug speech she would deliver at the next HOA meeting, already planning how she would rub my defeat in my face every single day for the rest of my time in Maple Grove. In her mind, this was her moment of triumph, the day she finally put me in my place, the day the natural order was restored and the Queen of Maple Grove demonstrated once and for all that nobody could challenge her authority. What she did not know was that I had a little surprise of my own sitting neatly inside my briefcase. Documents that would wipe that victorious grin right off her face. Evidence so ironic, so completely unbelievable, that even I had trouble accepting it when I first discovered it. Judge Robert Hamilton presided over the case. He was a no-nonsense man in his 60s with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and having zero tolerance for drama or theatrics. He read through the case file with growing interest, occasionally pausing to flip back and forth between documents. Karen's attorney, Bradley Morrison, went first. He did his best with the material he had, arguing that I was simply a delinquent homeowner trying to avoid my legal responsibilities through obscure technicalities. He claimed that the 1973 lease agreement was outdated, irrelevant, and had been superseded by subsequent property transfers. He argued that even if the lease was valid, I should still be subject to HOA rules because I was benefiting from the neighborhood amenities. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the room knew it. Bradley delivered it without conviction, like an actor reciting lines from a play he knew was terrible. Then David stood up. He was calm, steady, completely unruffled by the preceding arguments. He buttoned his suit jacket, walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, and began to lay out our case. He started with the history. He explained how the Maple Grove subdivision had been developed in the early 1970s using land leases to finance construction. He showed the original documents, certified by the county recorder, proving that my property was subject to a 9-to-9-year lease that had been paid in full in 1973. Then he explained how that lease predated the formation of the HOA by nearly a decade. The HOA had been established in 1982, 9 years after the lease was executed. By definition, properties subject to pre-existing legal agreements could not be retroactively brought under HOA jurisdiction without the explicit consent of the property owner. No such consent had ever been given. Then came the bombshell. "Your Honor," David said, approaching the bench with a thick folder of documents, "there is one more matter we need to address. During our research into the property records for this case, we discovered something quite remarkable." He spread out the survey maps, the building permits, and the aerial photographs on the courtroom table. "Mrs. Pembroke's house," he continued, "the house from which she has been conducting HOA business and issuing fines for over 20 years, is partially built on land covered by my client's lease agreement. Approximately 20 feet of her lot, including a portion of her house's foundation and a significant portion of her backyard, are technically on my client's leased property." Judge Hamilton leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. He examined the survey maps carefully, comparing them to the satellite images on his laptop. The room fell absolutely silent except for the shuffle of papers. "Let me make sure I understand this," Judge Hamilton said slowly, each word deliberate and measured. "Mrs. Pembroke's house, the one from which she conducts HOA business, the one from which she has been issuing fines to Mr. Thompson and threatening to foreclose on his property, is partially built on land that is leased to Mr. Thompson." "That is correct, Your Honor," David replied. The judge turned to Karen, who had gone from confident pink to sickly pale. "Mrs. Pembroke, were you aware of this when you purchased your home?" Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the first I am hearing of it." "And yet," the judge continued, his tone sharpening, "you have been collecting HOA dues from neighboring properties for 30 years. You have been issuing fines for violations as minor as the color of a garden hose. You have been threatening to foreclose on Mr. Thompson's home over dues you claim he owes. And all this time, you have been living, at least partially, on land that belongs to someone else." The HOA was established legally. Karen protested weakly. "We have proper documentation. Everything was filed correctly." "Documentation," Judge Hamilton replied evenly. "That does not supersede prior property rights, Mrs. Pembroke. A homeowners association cannot claim authority over land that was already encumbered by a pre-existing lease agreement. That is basic property law." For 10 long minutes, Judge Hamilton reviewed every detail of the case. He examined the original lease, compared it to the current survey, studied the building permits for Karen's house, and reviewed the timeline of events. The courtroom was completely silent except for the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, he set down the file and folded his hands in front of him. His expression was serious but satisfied, like a man who had just completed a complicated puzzle. "I have heard enough," he said. "First, regarding the plaintiff's claims, I find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Thompson. His property is clearly exempt from HOA membership based on pre-existing agreements that were properly recorded with the county in 1973. The plaintiff's claims for unpaid dues, late fees, and associated penalties are dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Pembroke has no legal standing to collect any fees from Mr. Thompson, and she never has." Karen made a small choking sound in the back of her throat, but the judge was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, regarding the defendant's counterclaim. I find that Mrs. Pembroke has indeed been unjustly enriched by the unauthorized use of the defendant's leased land. Her house was constructed in 1991, partially on land covered by a lease that was executed 18 years prior. For 30 years, she has been using, occupying, and benefiting from land that she has no legal right to occupy. He paused to consult some notes on his desk. While I will not order the removal of the encroaching structure due to the time that has elapsed and the hardship such an order would cause, I am ordering that Mrs. Pembroke pay fair market rent for this land. Based on current property values in the Maple Grove area and the square footage of the encroachment, I calculate fair market rent at $400 per month. He looked directly at Karen, who seemed to have stopped breathing. Mrs. Pembroke, you are hereby ordered to pay Mr. Thompson $18,000 in back rent for the past 3 years, which is the maximum recovery period under our statute of limitations. Going forward, you will pay Mr. Thompson $400 per month in rent for the land your house occupies. This rent shall be subject to annual adjustments based on the Consumer Price Index to account for inflation. Failure to make these payments will result in further legal action, up to and including eviction from the encroaching portion of your property. Karen shot up from her chair so fast that it clattered backward onto the courtroom floor. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. This is outrageous, she shouted, her voice cracking with fury. I'm not paying rent for my own property. I have lived there for 20 years. My children grew up there. You cannot possibly expect me to pay rent to this. She pointed at me with a shaking finger, this interloper who just moved in 6 months ago. Judge Hamilton's expression hardened. It is not your property, Mrs. Pembroke, he said, his voice cold as steel. At least, not all of it. 20 feet of what you consider your property actually belongs to someone else, and it has for over 50 years. You built on land you did not own, and now you are obligated to pay for your use of that land. I would suggest you watch your tone in my courtroom. You are fortunate that Mr. Thompson is not seeking to have your house torn down. That would be well within his legal rights. Karen stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. Her designer suit suddenly looked like a costume, her perfectly styled hair like a joke. Bradley Morrison was already packing up his briefcase with the weary resignation of a man who had warned his client this would happen and been ignored. But Judge Hamilton still was not finished. One more thing, he said. It has come to my attention during these proceedings that you, Mrs. Pembroke, have been engaging in a pattern of harassment against Mr. Thompson. Excessive fines for trivial violations, threats of foreclosure, demands for payment of debts he did not owe. This behavior stops immediately. Any further harassment, any further attempts to collect fees or issue fines against Mr. Thompson will be considered a violation of this court's order and will be handled accordingly. I trust I have made myself clear. Yes, Your Honor, Karen managed to choke out. Court is adjourned, Judge Hamilton said, and banged his gavel with a finality that seemed to echo through the room for several seconds. I sat perfectly still for a long moment, processing what had just happened. $18,000, $400 a month, a complete victory on every count. And the look on Karen Pembroke's face, a look of utter devastation, complete disbelief, total psychological annihilation, was worth more than any amount of money. David clapped me on the shoulder. Congratulations, he said. That went even better than I expected. As I left the courtroom, I heard Karen's voice echoing down the hallway. She was on her phone, pacing frantically, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Emergency board meeting, she was saying, her voice high and tight. Tonight. No, it cannot wait until Tuesday. This is a crisis. I need the full board at my house at 7 o'clock. I allowed myself a small smile as I walked out into the afternoon sunshine. Justice had been served, but the story was not quite over yet. The weeks that followed were like living in a different neighborhood entirely. Word of Coren's humiliating defeat spread through Maple Grove like wildfire. Neighbors who had avoided me for months suddenly wanted to be my best friend. They stopped me in my driveway, flagged me down on my evening walks, found excuses to knock on my door. "I cannot believe you finally got her," said my neighbor Frank, a retired electrician who lived 3 houses down. "She fined me $200 last year because my Christmas lights were up 2 days past the January 15th deadline. 2 days. I was in the hospital with pneumonia." Another neighbor, a young mother named Jessica, told me that Karen had once demanded she repaint her front door because the shade of red she had chosen was too festive and not on the approved color list. It cost her $400 to repaint in a more subdued burgundy. Story after story emerged. Karen had terrorized this neighborhood for 20 years, ruling with an iron fist and an ever-present clipboard. She had driven multiple families out of Maple Grove entirely, unable to stand her constant harassment. She had destroyed the peace and joy of homeownership for dozens of people, all in the name of maintaining neighborhood standards. But now, finally, someone had beaten her, and the neighbors were celebrating. 2 weeks after the trial, 2 letters arrived in my mailbox on the same day. The first was a thick envelope from the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. Inside was a certified check for $18,000, representing 3 years of back rent, plus a signed rental agreement for the land going forward. Karen's signature was scrawled at the bottom, angry and jagged, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had almost torn through. The second letter was thinner, just a single page. It was also from the Maple Grove HOA, but it was addressed to all residents. I read it standing right there at my mailbox, the autumn sun warm on my face. "Dear Maple Grove homeowners," it began. "It is with mixed emotions that we announce the immediate resignation of Corinne Pembroke from her position as president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. Mrs. Pembroke has served in this capacity for over 20 years and has been a tireless advocate for maintaining our neighborhood standards. However, due to recent personal matters, she has decided to step down effective immediately. We wish her well in her future endeavors. The board will be holding elections for a new president at next month's regular meeting. All homeowners are encouraged to attend and participate in this important process." I read the letter twice, savoring every word. Karen had been forced out. The neighbors had finally had enough. I later learned from the gossip network that the board had voted unanimously to remove her after learning the full details of the lawsuit and the humiliation she had brought upon the HOA. Her iron-fisted rule was over, destroyed not by organized resistance, but by her own arrogance and the karmic justice of property law. Every month after that, like clockwork, a check for $400 arrived in my mailbox. The first few checks came with nothing but the bare minimum information required. Check number, date, amount. But around month 4, Karen started including little notes, passive-aggressive gems that I collected and saved because they brought me such joy. "Hope this helps with your property, since you clearly cannot afford to maintain it yourself," read one. Another said simply, "Enjoy your blood money." My personal favorite arrived around month 7. "Must be nice," it read in Karen's precise handwriting, "to steal from hard-working people who actually earned what they have." I framed that one and hung it in my kitchen. The final twist in this saga came about 6 months after the trial. I was in my backyard one Saturday morning, working in the garden I had finally been able to plant without fear of HOA violations, when I heard a commotion coming from Karen's property. I looked over the fence and saw a large moving truck parked in her driveway. A crew of movers was carrying furniture out of her house and loading it into the truck. Karen herself stood on her front porch, supervising the operation with the same imperious manner she had once used to survey the entire neighborhood. But she looked different now, smaller somehow, diminished. Her designer clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her perfectly styled hair had lost some of its architectural precision. She caught me watching, and for a long moment we just stared at each other across the fence that separated our properties, the fence that stood partially on my land, the fence that represented everything she had lost. Then she turned away and went inside, closing the door firmly behind her. I learned later that she had sold the house at a steep loss. She was legally required to disclose the land lease situation to every potential buyer, which made the property much harder to sell. The encroachment issue was now part of the permanent record, a scarlet letter that would follow the property forever. Several potential buyers had walked away when they learned that 20 feet of their prospective home would require monthly rent payments to a neighbor. Finally, a young couple made an offer. The Johnstons, recently married and expecting their first child, were willing to take on the complication in exchange for a significantly reduced purchase price. They seemed like good people when they introduced themselves at closing, and my initial impression proved accurate. The Johnstons moved in 2 weeks later. Unlike Karen, they were genuinely friendly neighbors. They understood the lease situation perfectly and paid their fee promptly on the first of every month. They invited me to their housewarming party, where I met their extended family and shared the story of how I had come to own the land beneath their back porch. Their reaction was not horror or resentment. It was laughter. Disbelieving, delighted laughter at the cosmic irony of Karen Pembroke's downfall. "I cannot believe she fined you for a green garden hose," said the husband, whose name was Michael. "And then it turned out her house was on your land the whole time. That is literally the funniest thing I have ever heard." As for Karen, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to a subdivision across town, a newer development called Riverside Terrace, with wide streets and cookie-cutter houses, and notably, no homeowners association. I imagine she could not stomach the idea of living under someone else's rules after so many years of making the rules herself. I hope she found some peace there. I genuinely do. I never wanted to destroy her life or take her home or humiliate her in public. All I ever wanted was to be left alone, to enjoy my new house and my fresh start without being harassed over the length of my grass or the color of my blinds. But she would not let me have that. She pushed and pushed and pushed, absolutely certain that I would crumble like everyone else. She never imagined that I might push back, and she certainly never imagined that my push would reveal the ironic truth that the ground she stood on, the throne from which she ruled her tiny kingdom, had never really been hers at all. That is the thing about people like Karen. They spend so much time policing everyone else's behavior that they never stop to examine their own. They are so focused on the speck of sawdust in their neighbor's eye that they miss the plank in their own. And eventually, inevitably, that plank trips them up. I still live in that corner house on Elm Street and 2nd Avenue. The Johnstons and I have become good friends. Their baby daughter, who was born about a year after they moved in, calls me Uncle Marcus, even though we are not actually related. I taught Michael how to maintain his lawn at the proper height, not because there is an HOA requiring it anymore, but because it genuinely looks better that way. His wife Sarah brings me homemade cookies every Christmas as a thank you for being such an understanding landlord. The Maple Grove HOA still exists, but under new leadership, it is a different organization entirely. The new president, a retired school teacher named Dorothy Chen, has rolled back most of Karen's more ridiculous requirements. The approved color list has been eliminated. The grass height regulation has been relaxed. The 2-hour limit on moving trucks has been extended to a more reasonable 8 hours. And my property remains completely exempt from all of it. Not that it matters anymore. The new HOA leaves me alone, and I leave them alone. We coexist peacefully, like neighbors should. Every January, when that annual rent check arrives from the Johnstons, I cannot help but remember the day Karen Pembroke learned the hard way that karma has a very long memory. I think about her face in that courtroom, the moment the judge explained that her throne had been built on borrowed land. I think about the $18,000 check she had to write, her angry signature pressing through the paper. I think about the moving truck in her driveway and the way she could not meet my eyes when she left for the last time. And I smile, not because I am cruel, not because I take pleasure in someone else's suffering, but because sometimes, in this messy and unfair world, justice actually prevails. Sometimes the bully gets what they deserve. Sometimes the little guy wins. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person who tries to push everyone else around discovers that the ground beneath their feet was never as solid as they assumed. So that is my story. The story of how I accidentally discovered that the Queen of Maple Grove had been living on my land for 30 years. The story of how I went from victim to victor without ever throwing a punch. The story of how karma, patience, and a 70-year-old lease agreement combined to deliver the most satisfying revenge I could ever have imagined. If you enjoyed this story, if it gave you hope that justice is still possible, even when the odds seem stacked against you, then I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Join our community of people who believe in fighting back against injustice, one story at a time. We share stories like this every single day, real accounts of ordinary people standing up to bullies, tyrants, and entitled individuals who think the rules do not apply to them. These stories will change how you see the world. They will inspire you to stand up for yourself. And they will satisfy that deep need we all have to see the bad guys get exactly what they deserve. Until next time, this is Marcus Thompson, reminding you that sometimes the person you try to push around just might own the ground beneath your feet.